A woman everyone called too weak to handle military training stands on a rooftop in downtown Seattle, watching through her scope as armed terrorists hold 37 hostages in the federal building below. The SWAT commander has just told her she has one shot, one impossible shot, to end a crisis that could claim dozens of innocent lives. The same woman who was laughed out of Marine sniper school just 18 months earlier for being too slow and too emotional is now the only person positioned to prevent a massacre. Her name is Audrey Miller. And this is the story of how the biggest failure of her life became the moment that saved everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for youth. Georgia heat hit Audrey Miller like a wall as she stepped off the military transport at Camp Henderson, her single duffel bag slung over her shoulder and her grandfather's hunting rifle secured in a weathered case. The sprawling training facility stretched across thousands of acres of pine forest and red clay, its reputation as the most challenging sniper school in the Marines preceding it like a storm cloud. Audrey paused at the gates, watching as other recruits unloaded their gear with practiced efficiency. Their equipment gleamed, precision rifles that cost more than most people's cars, tactical gear that looked like it belonged in a science fiction movie, and accessories that spoke of serious financial backing. At 28, she was older than most of them by nearly a decade, her background in civilian law enforcement making her an anomaly in a program designed for fresh Marine graduates. Her own rifle, a modified Remington 700 that had belonged to her grandfather during his time as a police sniper in Detroit, seemed almost quaint by comparison. The wooden stock showed wear from decades of careful maintenance, and while every component had been lovingly upgraded over the years, it lacked the intimidating presence of the modern platform surrounding her. Jesus, did someone call the Historical Society? The voice belonged to Marcus Webb, a cocky recruit from California whose father had apparently spent $30,000 outfitting him for this program. His comment drew snickers from the small group gathering near the barracks. "I think your grandmother called. She wants her dear rifle back." Audrey didn't respond. She'd learned long ago that engaging with that type of comment only fed the fire. Instead, she pulled out a small notebook, leather-bound and filled with handwritten observations about wind patterns, ballistic calculations, and environmental factors she'd been studying for months in preparation for this moment. Webb noticed the notebook and his grin widened. "Oh man, she's got homework. Hey everybody, look, the new girl brought her diary to sniper school." The laughter was immediate and cruel, but Audrey remained focused on her notes. She'd driven 18 hours from her job as a police officer in Phoenix, using every day of vacation time she'd accumulated over 5 years to attend this program. Her department had reluctantly granted her the leave, and her captain had made it clear that if she washed out, her career prospects back home would be limited. "Miller, Audrey J." The voice cut through the mockery like a blade. Gunnery Sergeant Rodriguez stood at the barracks entrance, his presence immediately commanding respect. Front and center, Audrey jogged to the position, her movements crisp. Despite the exhaustion of the long drive, Rodriguez looked her up and down, taking in her civilian hiking boots, faded jeans, and the obvious age difference between her and the other recruits. "Police transfer?" Rodriguez asked, consulting his clipboard. "Yes, Gunny. Phoenix PD, 5 years patrol, specialized in crisis response." Rodriguez raised an eyebrow. "Crisis response? That's a fancy way of saying you talk people off ledges?" "Sometimes. Gunny, sometimes I have to make other decisions." The gunnery sergeant studied her for a moment longer. "Miller, you understand this isn't civilian law enforcement. This is Marine Corps' precision shooting. Speed, accuracy, and lethality under combat conditions. You think your police experience translates?" "I think good shooting is good shooting, Gunny," regardless of the uniform. Rodriguez's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Perhaps surprise at her confidence, perhaps skepticism. We'll see about that. Rack assignment is bunk 12. Evening briefing at 1900 hours. Don't be late. As Audrey made her way to the barracks, she overheard Webb talking to his new buddies. $5 as the cop washes out before the first live fire exercise. She's probably used to shooting at paper targets from 20 yards. This is the real deal. The barracks themselves were Spartan but functional. Audrey's bunk was at the far end, which suited her fine. She preferred the quiet corner where she could observe without being constantly scrutinized. As she unpacked her minimal gear, she noticed the recruit in the next bunk watching her with curious eyes. "I'm Sarah Chun," the young woman said quietly. "Marine Corps, fresh out of infantry training. Audrey Miller." "Nice to meet you, Sarah." Chun glanced around to make sure they weren't being overheard. "Don't let Webb get to you. He's been trash-talking everyone since we got here. Apparently his father is some big defense contractor who thinks buying expensive equipment makes his son a better Marine." Audrey smiled. "I've dealt with guys like that before. Usually, the loudest ones have the most to prove." "Your rifle," Chun continued, nodding toward Audrey's case. "Is it really your grandfather's?" "Modified and upgraded, but yes. He carried it for 23 years with Detroit PD. Taught me to shoot with it when I was 12. Audrey opened the case, revealing the carefully maintained weapon. "It's not fancy, but it's never let me down." Chun examined the rifle with obvious appreciation. "My grandfather always said the shooter matters more than the gun. Smart man." That evening's briefing laid out the brutal reality of Marine Corps sniper training. The program had a 70% failure rate, with most recruits washing out. In the first 2 weeks, the standards were unforgiving, perfect scores required, no second chances given, and absolute adherence to Marine Corps protocols. "This program exists to create the deadliest precision shooters in the world," announced Colonel Patricia Hayes, the commanding officer. "We don't care about your background, your equipment, or your excuses. We care about results. Miss your standards, and you're gone. Question our methods, and you're gone. Think you know better than instructors who've been perfecting these techniques for decades, and you're gone." Audrey listened carefully, taking notes while most of the other recruits tried to look confident. The colonel's words were clearly directed at weeding out anyone who might not fully commit to the program's demanding requirements. Asterisk, training begins at 0500 hours tomorrow. Colonel Hayes continued. Equipment inspection, physical fitness assessment, and preliminary marksmanship evaluation. Gentlemen and ladies, welcome to the most challenging 8 weeks of your military careers. As the briefing concluded and recruits began filing out, Audrey noticed Rodriguez approaching her position. Miller, a word. They stepped outside into the humid Georgia evening. Rodriguez lit a cigarette and studied her for a moment. "You know you're going to have a target on your back from day one," he said finally. "Because I'm older?" "Because you're different. Different age, different background, different equipment. Some of these instructors have been teaching the same methods for 20 years. They don't like variables they can't control." Audrey considered this. "Are you telling me to conform, Gunny?" Rodriguez took a long drag from his cigarette. "I'm telling you to be ready. This program breaks people who don't fit the mold. The question is whether you're tough enough to prove the mold is wrong." As they walked back toward the barracks, Audrey felt the weight of the challenge ahead. She'd spent months preparing for this opportunity, but she was beginning to understand that the technical aspects of sniper training might be the least of her concerns. The real battle would be proving that experience, patience, and unconventional thinking could succeed in a system designed to reward conformity and aggression. She'd been the outsider before, in a male-dominated police force, in crisis situations where her approach differed from protocol. In a world that often valued appearance over substance, but she'd never faced anything quite like this. 8 weeks to prove that a 28-year-old cop with her grandfather's rifle could hang with the Marine Corps' best and brightest. The lights-out call echoed across the base as Audrey settled into her bunk. Tomorrow would bring the first real test, and she had no illusions about the challenges ahead. But as she ran her hand over her grandfather's rifle case, she remembered something he'd told her years ago. "Audrey, the gun doesn't make the shooter. The shooter makes the gun sing." She was about to find out if she could make her grandfather's old rifle sing loud enough to silence all the doubts. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The alarm pierced the darkness at 0430 hours, 30 minutes before the scheduled wake-up call. Audrey was already awake, having spent most of the night listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the Georgia wilderness and mentally preparing for what lay ahead. Around her, groggy recruits stumbled from their bunks, some clearly unprepared for the brutal early start. Marcus Webb emerged from his bunk looking like he'd been hit by a truck, his expensive tactical pajamas wrinkled and his hair sticking up at odd angles. "This is insane," he muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "My father's going to hear about these conditions." Audrey silently laced her boots, the same sturdy hiking boots that had carried her through 5 years of patrol work. They weren't issued Marine gear, but they were broken in and reliable. Around her, other recruits struggled with brand-new combat boots that squeaked and caused obvious discomfort. The morning physical fitness assessment was brutal. A 5-mile run through the Georgia pine forest, followed by an obstacle course designed to test upper body strength, agility, and mental toughness. Audrey found herself in the middle of the pack, not the fastest, but steady and consistent. Her police training had emphasized endurance over speed, and it showed. Webb, despite his expensive gear and obvious athletic build, struggled with the sustained pace. By mile 3, he was breathing heavily and had fallen behind several positions. Sarah Chun, meanwhile, moved with the efficient grace of someone who'd been conditioned by Marine infantry training. "Time," Gunnery Sergeant Rodriguez called out as the last recruits crossed the finish line. "Acceptable performance from most of you, unacceptable from some." His eyes swept over the group, lingering on the stragglers. "Equipment inspection in 30 minutes. I suggest you move quickly." The equipment inspection revealed the first major divide among the recruits. Those with military backgrounds had their gear arranged with precision, every item in its designated place, every surface clean and organized. The civilian transfers, including Audrey, faced immediate criticism. "Miller," Rodriguez barked, stopping at her position. "What is this supposed to be?" He was looking at her rifle case, which admittedly looked humble compared to the high-tech carriers surrounding it. "That's my rifle case, Gunny. This looks like something you'd take duck hunting, not precision military shooting." Rodriguez opened the case, revealing the modified Remington 700. The rifle was immaculate, every surface cleaned and oiled, the scope properly mounted and zeroed. But it was clearly older and more traditional than the modern platforms the other recruits carried. "The rifle is fully functional and properly maintained, Gunny," Audrey said evenly. Rodriguez picked up the weapon, examining the action and checking the scope mounts. Despite his criticism, Audrey could see he was impressed with the weapon's condition. "This is a hunting rifle, Miller. We're training military snipers. The rifle has been modified for precision shooting, Gunny. Match-grade barrel, custom trigger, military specification scope. It meets all the program requirements listed in the pre-arrival packet." "Barely." Rodriguez set the rifle back in its case. "Don't expect any special consideration because you're attached to Granddaddy's duck gun." As Rodriguez moved on, Audrey heard Webb whispering to his nearby recruits. "I'm telling you, she doesn't belong here." Police work is completely different from military operations. She's going to get someone killed if they actually let her graduate. The whispers were loud enough to be clearly intentional, designed to undermine her confidence and social standing within the group. Audrey had encountered similar tactics during her police career, usually from officers who felt threatened by competence they couldn't understand. The first marksmanship evaluation took place that afternoon on a range that stretched across rolling hills covered in pine and scrub oak. 12 shooting positions, each equipped with sandbags and shooting mats, faced targets at distances ranging from 100 to 600 yards. "Ladies and gentlemen," announced Staff Sergeant Williams, the primary marksmanship instructor, "this is your baseline evaluation. We need to see what you can do before we start teaching you how to do it properly. You'll engage targets at 100, 300, and 500 yards. 3 shots per target, no time limit on this exercise. We want to see your natural shooting ability." Audrey felt a familiar calm settle over her as she took her position. This was where background and equipment mattered less than fundamental skill and mental discipline. She'd been shooting competitively since high school and had thousands of rounds of experience with her grandfather's rifle. The 100-yard targets were straightforward. She placed 3 shots within a 1-inch group, dead center in the scoring ring. At 300 yards, the Georgia wind became a factor, but Audrey had spent years reading wind conditions during police training exercises. Her 3 shots formed a tight cluster just slightly left of center dot. The 500-yard shots separated the experienced shooters from those relying purely on equipment. Audrey took her time, studying the wind flags and making careful adjustments to her scope. Her first shot hit center mass. The second shot was slightly high. The third shot split the difference perfectly. Webb, shooting 2 positions to her left, was having obvious difficulties. His expensive semi-automatic rifle was capable of rapid fire, but the 500-yard distance required precision and patience. She could hear him muttering curses as his shots scattered across the target. "Time," Williams called. "Weapons safe, step back from the firing line." The scoring process revealed significant disparities in ability. Sarah Chun had shot exceptionally well, as had several of the Marine recruits with infantry backgrounds. Webb's scores were mediocre at best, with several shots completely missing the 500-yard target. Audrey's scores placed her in the top 3 performers overall. "Not bad for a duck hunting rifle," Rodriguez commented when the results were posted. It was the closest thing to a compliment she'd received since arriving. That evening, as recruits cleaned their weapons and prepared for the next day's training, Audrey found herself isolated from most social interactions. The military recruits formed natural groups based on their shared experiences, while the few civilian transfers struggled to find their place in the hierarchy. Sarah Chun approached her during the weapon cleaning session. "Nice shooting today. That group at 500 yards was impressive." "Thanks, your scores were excellent too." Chun lowered her voice. "Webb's been talking to some of the other guys. He's saying you only did well because the conditions were easy and there was no time pressure." Audrey wasn't surprised. People say a lot of things when they're feeling insecure about their own performance. He's also saying that police shooting and military shooting are completely different. That you won't be able to handle real combat scenarios. "Maybe he's right," Audrey said, continuing to clean her rifle. "I guess we'll find out during the next phase of training." Chun studied her curiously. "You don't seem worried." "I've been underestimated before. Usually by people who confuse talking with performing." The conversation was interrupted by Webb's loud voice from across the barracks. "I'm just saying, this isn't community college marksmanship class. When we get to the advanced training, the real military stuff, some people are going to find out they're in over their heads." His comments were clearly directed at Audrey, and several recruits glanced in her direction to gauge her reaction. She continued cleaning her rifle methodically. giving no indication that she'd heard anything. Later that night, as the barracks settled into quiet, Audrey reviewed her notes from the day's training. She'd documented wind conditions, target configurations, and observations about the different shooting positions. But she'd also noted the social dynamics and the clear efforts to isolate her from the group. Her grandfather had faced similar challenges during his early police career in Detroit. He'd told her stories about proving herself in an environment that didn't want to accept outsiders. The secret, he'd said, is to let your work speak louder than their words. Tomorrow would bring more complex training exercises, and Audrey knew the pressure would only increase. Webb and his supporters would be looking for any sign of weakness, any mistake they could use to validate their belief that she didn't belong. But as she ran her hand along her grandfather's rifle, she felt the confidence that came from years of disciplined practice and proven performance. The weapon had never let her family down, and she had no intention of being the first to break that tradition. The lights-out call echoed through the barracks, and Audrey settled into her bunk, knowing that the real test was just beginning. The baseline evaluation had shown she could compete with the best shooters in the program. Now she had to prove she could excel in the increasingly demanding challenges ahead. Outside, the Georgia night was filled with the sounds of insects and distant training exercises. Somewhere in the darkness, other groups of military personnel were conducting their own forms of specialized training. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was proving that experience, dedication, and unconventional thinking could succeed. In a system designed to reward conformity, the battle for respect had begun, and Audrey Miller was ready to fight it one shot at a time. Week 2 brought the psychological warfare training, and it was designed to break minds before it tested marksmanship skills. The Georgia heat had intensified, turning the training ground into a furnace that sapped energy and tested mental resilience. But the weather was nothing compared to what Staff Sergeant Kevin Morrison had planned for the recruits. Morrison was a legend at camp. Henderson, a former Force Recon Marine who'd completed 3 combat deployments and held the base record for longest confirmed kill. He was also notorious for his ability to identify and exploit psychological weaknesses in sniper candidates. Mental toughness separates real snipers from weekend hunters, Morrison announced to the assembled recruits. This week, we're going to find out who has what it takes to function under real combat stress. The training began with sensory deprivation exercises designed to simulate the isolation and pressure of extended surveillance missions. Recruits were placed in individual bunkers with minimal light, required to maintain observation logs for 12-hour periods while random stress factors were introduced: loud noises, temperature fluctuations, and psychological pressure from instructors. Audrey found herself assigned to Bunker 7, a concrete box barely large enough for one person to lie prone with a rifle. The observation port faced a mock village, where role-playing actors moved through scenarios that required constant vigilance and detailed reporting. "Miller," Morrison's voice crackled through the communication system, "I see you've got your little notebook out. This isn't a library study session. Real snipers don't have time for homework." The comment drew laughter from other recruits monitoring the exercise. Audrey continued taking notes, documenting movement patterns and potential threat indicators in the village scenario. Her police training had taught her that detailed observation often revealed crucial information that casual watching missed. 6 hours into the exercise, Morrison introduced the first major stress factor. "Miller, we've just received intelligence that one of the civilians in your observation area is actually a suicide bomber. You have 30 seconds to identify the threat and take the shot." Audrey studied the scene carefully. 3 civilians were visible: an elderly man sitting on a bench, a woman hanging laundry, and a teenager walking between buildings. None showed obvious threat indicators, but Morrison's exercise was designed to force hasty decisions under pressure. "Time's running out, Miller. In a real situation, Hesitation gets people killed. Audrey continued her observation, noting that the teenager was moving with purpose, but not urgency. The woman was engaged in normal domestic activity, and the elderly man appeared to be reading something. Negative on the shot, Sergeant. No clear threat indicators visible. Wrong answer, Miller. The teenager was carrying explosives. Your hesitation just killed 20 innocent people. The psychological impact was immediate and intentional. Several recruits had already taken shots during similar scenarios, often hitting innocent role players and failing the exercise. Morrison's method was designed to create doubt and second-guessing. Marcus Webb, monitoring from Bunker 3, had taken a shot at a woman carrying groceries during his scenario. At least I had the courage to act, his voice came through the communication system. Some people freeze when it matters. But Morrison wasn't finished with Audrey. Miller, let's try another scenario. You're providing overwatch for a patrol that's about to be ambushed. You can see the ambush position, but your shot will be at 800 yards in crosswind conditions. Take the shot or watch Marines die. This time, the scenario was more complex. Audrey could see a figure positioned behind cover with what appeared to be a weapon. The wind flag showed gusting conditions that would challenge even experienced shooters. Her grandfather's rifle was capable of the shot, but the margin for error was minimal. Engaging target, Audrey announced, making careful adjustments for wind and distance. She controlled her breathing, found her natural point of aim, and squeezed the trigger steadily. The shot hit center mass on the target. Morrison's voice was grudgingly respectful. Clean hit, Miller. Maybe you've got something after all. But Webb's response came immediately through the communication system. Lucky shot. Let's see her do it again when she's really under pressure. The pattern continued. For 3 days, Morrison would present increasingly complex scenarios designed to test judgment, marksmanship, and mental resilience under pressure. Some recruits cracked under the psychological warfare, making emotional decisions that failed the exercises. Others, like Webb, became increasingly aggressive, taking shots that would have resulted in civilian casualties in real situations. Audrey found herself walking a careful line between caution and action. Her police experience had taught her to evaluate threats carefully before using deadly force. But the military exercises often rewarded aggressive response over careful analysis. The breaking point came during the final day of psychological training. Morrison had designed a scenario where recruits had to maintain observation for 8 hours while enduring sleep deprivation, irregular meals, and constant psychological pressure. Miller, Morrison's voice came through the speakers at hour 6. I've been reviewing your police records. Says here you talked a jumper off a bridge last year instead of letting the crisis team handle it. You seem to have a pattern of thinking you know better than established procedures. The personal attack was clearly designed to provoke an emotional response. Around the observation bunkers, other recruits were listening to see how Audrey would handle the pressure. My job was to preserve life, Sergeant. The method was less important than the result. Your job now is to follow military protocol, Morrison continued. Police work is about talking and community relations. Military sniping is about eliminating threats efficiently. Maybe you're in the wrong program. Webb's voice joined the psychological assault. Maybe she should go back to writing parking tickets. Leave the real work to real Marines. The combination of sleep deprivation, physical stress, and coordinated psychological pressure was having its intended effect. Several recruits had already broken down or made critical errors under similar assault. Audrey felt her composure wavering for the first time since arriving at Camp Henderson, but instead of responding emotionally, she remembered something her grandfather had told her during her police training. When people try to make you angry, they're usually trying to make you stupid. Don't give them the satisfaction. Understood, Sergeant, she replied simply, continuing her observation duties without further comment. Morrison tried several more psychological attacks, questioning her age, her equipment, and her background. But Audrey had found her center and refused to be drawn into emotional responses that would compromise her performance. When the 8-hour exercise finally ended, the results were telling. 3 recruits had been eliminated from the program for emotional breakdowns or critical errors. Webb had performed adequately, but had shown signs of frustration and poor judgment under extended pressure. Sarah Chun had excelled, maintaining steady performance throughout the ordeal. Audrey's scores placed her among the top performers, but the cost was evident. The psychological warfare had taken a toll on group dynamics, creating hostility and suspicion among recruits who were supposed to be developing teamwork skills. That evening, as recruits cleaned their equipment and prepared for the next phase of training, the atmosphere in the barracks was tense. The eliminated recruits had been quietly processed out, their bunks now empty reminders of the program's unforgiving standards. Webb approached Audrey's position with several supporters in tow. "I've been thinking about your performance this week," he said, his voice carrying across the quiet barracks. "You did well on the technical stuff, but you hesitated on the action scenarios. In real combat, that hesitation could get people killed." "Maybe," Audrey replied, continuing to clean her rifle. "Or maybe taking the wrong shot gets the wrong people killed." "What's that supposed to mean?" Audrey looked up from her work. "It means I'd rather take an extra second to be sure than spend a lifetime knowing I shot an innocent person." Webb's face flushed with anger. "That's exactly the kind of thinking that makes you a liability. Military snipers can't afford to second-guess every decision." "Neither can police officers," Audrey replied calmly. "But we can afford to think before we shoot." The confrontation was interrupted by the arrival of Gunnery Sergeant Rodriguez, who'd been observing from the doorway. "Interesting philosophical discussion," he said, his voice cutting through the tension. "Webb, you seem to think faster is always better. Miller, you seem to think careful is always right. Next week's field exercises will test both theories." As Rodriguez left, Webb turned back to Audrey with undisguised hostility. "You think you're better than the rest of us because you're older and more experienced. But this isn't community policing. This is military precision shooting, and you're going to find out you don't belong here." The challenge was clear and public. Webb had positioned himself as the representative of traditional military thinking, while casting Audrey as an outsider, whose methods would prove inadequate under real pressure. As the lights went out that night, Audrey lay in her bunk knowing that the psychological warfare phase was ending, but the real battle for acceptance and respect was just beginning. The field exercises would test not just shooting skills, but judgment, teamwork, and the ability to perform under the kind of pressure that couldn't be simulated in controlled environments. Her grandfather's rifle lay in its case beside her bunk, ready for whatever challenges the coming week would bring. But Audrey knew that the hardest part wasn't the shooting, it was proving that her approach to precision and decision-making could succeed in a system that often valued speed over accuracy and aggression over judgment. The war of philosophies was about to be tested in the field, and the outcome would determine whether Audrey Miller had a future in Marine Corps sniper training, or if she'd become another casualty of a system that couldn't accommodate different ways of thinking about the same deadly serious job. The transport convoy rolled through the Georgia wilderness at dawn, carrying the remaining sniper candidates toward their first major field exercise. 3 weeks of training had whittled the original class from 24 recruits down to 16, and the upcoming week would determine who had the skills to advance to the program's final phase. Audrey sat in the back of the military truck, her grandfather's rifle case secured beside her as the vehicle bounced along dirt roads carved through dense pine forest. The destination was a remote training area known as the Crucible, 50 square miles of varied terrain, where candidates would face realistic combat scenarios with live ammunition and real consequences for failure. Colonel Hayes had briefed then the night before on what to expect. This exercise will test everything you've learned under field conditions. You'll work in teams, maintain operational security, and engage targets at unknown distances under stress. Some of you will excel. Others will discover that classroom knowledge doesn't translate to real-world performance. The team assignments had been strategically designed to create maximum challenge. Audrey found herself paired with Marcus Webb, a combination that Gunnery Sergeant Rodriguez had described as an opportunity for both of you to learn something. Webb's reaction to the pairing had been predictably negative. "Great, I get stuck. Babysitting the cop while everyone else gets real Marines as partners." But Sarah Chun, paired with another infantry Marine named David Thompson, had offered Audrey some encouragement. "Webb talks a lot, but he's never actually been in combat. You have real-world experience making life-and-death decisions. That matters more than he realizes." The convoy reached the staging area as the sun cleared the tree line, casting long shadows across a landscape that looked deceptively peaceful. Rolling hills covered in pine and hardwood forest stretched to the horizon, broken by streams, rocky outcroppings, and clearings that could conceal either opportunity or danger. Staff Sergeant Morrison gathered the teams around a tactical map spread across the hood of a Humvee. "Your mission is to establish observation posts overlooking this valley," he said, pointing to a complex terrain feature marked with various symbols. "Intelligence indicates enemy movement through the area. Your job is to identify, track, and engage high-value targets while avoiding detection." The briefing revealed the complexity of the exercise. Each team would be responsible for a sector of the valley, communicating with headquarters via radio while maintaining operational security. Targets would appear randomly throughout the day, requiring quick identification and precise engagement at distances up to 1,000 yards. "Rules of engagement are simple," Morrison continued. "Positive identification required before firing. Civilian casualties result in immediate failure. Mission duration is 18 hours. Questions?" Webb raised his hand. "What about ammunition restrictions?" "Limited to what you carry. Choose your shots carefully." As the teams dispersed to their assigned sectors, Audrey and Webb began the 2-mile hike to their observation post on a ridge overlooking the southern portion of the valley. The tension between them was immediate and obvious. "Let me make something clear," Webb said as they moved through the forest. "I've trained for this my entire Marine career. I'm not going to let your civilian police methods compromise my performance." "Understood," Audrey replied, focusing on the terrain and potential shooting positions ahead. "When we get to the observation post, I'll handle target identification and engagement. You can spot and provide security." Audrey didn't respond, but she noted that Webb was already assuming command despite their equal rank and the fact that this was supposed to be a team exercise. His approach would likely create problems when split-second coordination became necessary. Their assigned position was a rocky outcropping that provided excellent visibility across the valley but limited concealment from air observation. Webb immediately began setting up his position in the most obvious location, focusing on comfort rather than tactical concealment. "Webb," Audrey said quietly, "that position silhouettes you against the skyline. Any aerial surveillance will spot you immediately." "I need a clear shooting lane," Webb replied dismissively. "Concealment doesn't matter if you can't engage targets effectively." Audrey moved to an alternative position that offered similar visibility, but better camouflage among the rocks and vegetation. Her police training had emphasized the importance of observation without detection, skills that translated directly to sniper operations. The first targets appeared 2 hours into the exercise. 3 figures moving along a trail in the valley floor, approximately 600 yards from their position. Through her binoculars, Audrey could see they were wearing military-style clothing and carrying weapons. "I've got them," Webb announced immediately. acquiring the targets through his rifle scope. 3 military-age males, armed, moving south along Trail Charlie. "Wait," Audrey said, studying the figures more carefully. "Look at their movement pattern and equipment." Webb was already preparing to fire. "What are you talking about?" "They're clearly combatants. The lead figure is limping. The second one is supporting him. The third is carrying medical supplies, not ammunition. So what? Enemy combatants can be wounded." Audrey continued her observation, noting details that Webb's rush to engage had caused him to miss. "They're moving toward the medical station marked on our map. These could be friendly forces." "You're overthinking this," Webb said, his finger moving to the trigger. "The rules of engagement are clear. Armed military-age males in the operational area." "The rules also require positive identification," Audrey reminded him. "Are you certain these are enemy combatants?" Webb's frustration was evident. "While you're debating, they're getting away. In real combat, hesitation gets people killed." But Audrey's patience was vindicated when her radio crackled with a transmission from headquarters. "All stations, be advised. Friendly patrol with wounded moving through Sector 7 toward medical evacuation. Do not engage." The figures Webb had been about to shoot were American soldiers conducting a training evacuation exercise. "Lucky guess," Webb muttered, but his confidence had clearly been shaken. The pattern continued throughout the day. Webb's aggressive approach led to several near mistakes that Audrey's careful observation prevented. When legitimate targets did appear, role players representing enemy forces with proper identification markers, Audrey's shots were consistently more accurate than Webb's, particularly at longer ranges where patience and precision mattered. More than speed. The breaking point came during the afternoon when a complex scenario unfolded in the valley. Multiple figures appeared simultaneously at different locations, some clearly marked as enemies, others ambiguous. It was the kind of rapidly developing situation that required instant coordination between team members. "Multiple targets," Webb announced, swinging his rifle toward the nearest group. "I'm engaging the eastern group." "Negative," Audrey said firmly. "Eastern group has white armbands. They're marked as civilians. Then I'll take the western group." "Webb, stop. Look at the scenario carefully. This is a test of judgment, not just shooting." But Webb was committed to his aggressive approach. He fired at a figure in the western group, achieving a solid hit. Almost immediately, their radio exploded with angry voices from the exercise controllers. "Team 4, you have engaged a civilian role player. Immediate mission failure. Return to base for debrief." The walk back to the staging area was conducted in tense silence. Webb's face was flushed with anger and embarrassment, while Audrey focused on the lessons learned from the day's exercises. She'd prevented 3 potential friendly fire incidents through careful observation, but Webb's final shot had resulted in team failure regardless. At the debrief, Morrison was brutally honest in his assessment. "Webb, your aggressive approach shows good Marine spirit, but terrible judgment. You fired without confirming target identification, resulting in a civilian casualty that would have been a war crime in real combat." Webb's response was defensive. "In real combat, you don't have time for extended target analysis. You see a threat, you eliminate it." "In real combat," Morrison replied coldly, "killing the wrong person creates more enemies and destroys mission objectives." Miller's approach prevented multiple friendly fire incidents. "Your approach caused a mission failure." The public criticism was devastating for Webb, especially coming after weeks of positioning himself as the superior candidate. But Morrison wasn't finished. "Miller, your observation skills and judgment are excellent, but your hesitation to engage legitimate targets could be problematic in fast-developing situations. Both of you need to find balance between caution and action." As the teams prepared for the night phase of the exercise, the dynamics within the group had shifted significantly. Webb's credibility as a natural leader had been damaged, while Audrey's careful approach had gained respect from instructors and fellow candidates. But the field exercise was far from over. The night phase would test different skills entirely: operating in darkness, maintaining stealth, and engaging targets under conditions where mistakes were magnified and recovery was impossible. Sarah Chun approached Audrey during the brief rest period between exercises. "That was good work today. Webb's been talking about aggressive tactics for weeks, but you showed that thinking matters more than shooting fast." "He's not wrong about the need for decisive action," Audrey replied. "But you can't be decisive about the wrong target." The night was falling over the Georgia training ground, and with it came new challenges that would test whether Audrey's methodical approach could succeed. When split-second decisions meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Her grandfather's rifle was cleaned and ready, her notebook filled with observations from the day's lessons. But the real test was just beginning, proving that precision and judgment could prevail in a world that often rewarded speed and aggression over careful thought and accurate shooting. The night phase of the Crucible exercise began at 2,200 hours, with a mission brief that sent chills through the remaining candidates. 6 teams would infiltrate a mock terrorist compound under cover of darkness, establish overwatch positions, and await the arrival of high-value targets scheduled to appear at dawn. "Thermal imaging equipment is compromised," Staff Sergeant Morrison announced, his voice barely visible in the red-lit briefing tent. "You'll be operating with night vision only. The compound is populated with hostages, civilian role-players who must not be harmed. Your targets will be clearly marked with infrared strobe lights visible only through NVGs." Audrey adjusted her night vision goggles, testing the equipment that would mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Beside her, Marcus Webb was checking his gear with obvious nervousness. The day's mission failure had shaken his confidence, and the prospect of operating in darkness with civilian hostages present clearly worried him. "Remember," Morrison continued, "this exercise replicates real-world counter-terrorism operations. Precision is everything. Speed is worthless if you shoot the wrong person." The infiltration route required a 3-mile approach through dense forest, followed by the establishment of concealed positions around the target compound. Each team would be responsible for a different sector, with radio communication limited to emergency situations to maintain operational security. Webb and Audrey moved through the Georgia wilderness like mismatched partners in a deadly dance. Webb's anxiety manifested as excessive noise discipline violations, stepping on branches, catching equipment on vegetation, and generally moving like someone who'd learned fieldcraft in a classroom rather than through practical experience. "You're compromising our approach," Audrey whispered as Webb's rifle sling caught on a low branch for the 3rd time. "I'm fine," Webb hissed back, but his voice carried the strain of someone operating beyond his comfort zone. Audrey's police experience included night surveillance operations and drug interdiction work that had taught her to move quietly through urban and rural environments. She found herself unconsciously compensating for Webb's noise, choosing routes that would mask his movement and adjusting their pace to accommodate his struggling adaptation to night operations. Their assigned position overlooked the western approach to the compound, a cluster of buildings representing a terrorist safe house where hostages were supposedly being held. Through her night vision, Audrey could see role-players moving through the buildings, some wearing the civilian clothing of hostages, others dressed as armed guards. "I count 4 civilians and 2 guards in the main building," Audrey reported. Quietly, studying the scene through her binoculars, Webb was focused on setting up his shooting position, arranging sandbags and adjusting his rifle scope for night operations. "How can you tell the difference?" "They all look the same through NVGs, movement patterns. The civilians are moving randomly, showing stress behavior. The guards are conducting deliberate patrols with purpose and coordination. Whatever. When The targets show up. I'm taking the first clean shot I get. Audrey studied Webb's position and realized he'd made the same mistake as during the day exercise, prioritizing comfort over concealment. His muzzle flash would be visible to anyone observing from the compound, potentially compromising their mission and safety. Webb, you need to adjust your position. That shooting lane will expose your muzzle flash directly to the compound. I need a clear shot. Stop micromanaging. The radio crackled with a transmission from headquarters. All stations, target vehicles approaching from the north. 8 of 5 minutes. Stand by for target identification. Through her night vision, Audrey could see headlights approaching the compound. Along a dirt road, 2 vehicles carrying unknown occupants who would either be legitimate targets or additional civilians designed to test the candidates. Judgment under pressure. I've got eyes on the vehicles, Webb announced into his radio. Violating communication protocol by transmitting unnecessarily. Maintain radio silence unless engaging targets, came the sharp response from headquarters. The vehicle stopped at the compound and figures began emerging. Through her scope, Audrey could see some of the occupants were clearly marked with the infrared strobes identifying them as legitimate targets. But others wore no markings, creating the kind of complex scenario that required careful analysis before engagement. I count 3 targets with IR markers, Audrey whispered to Webb. But there are 6 total individuals. The unmarked ones could be additional hostages. Webb was already acquiring targets through his scope. I see the markers. I'm engaging. Wait. Study the scenario first. Look at how they're moving and interacting. But Webb's patience had been exhausted by the day's failures and the stress of night operations. He fired at the first marked target, achieving a solid hit that dropped the role player immediately. The shot's muzzle flash illuminated their position like a beacon, and immediately the compound erupted with activity. Role players representing guards began moving toward their location, while civilians scattered in panic. Webb, we're compromised, Audrey said urgently. Your muzzle flash gave away our position. So what? I got my target. But the exercise controllers had more surprises planned. Additional figures appeared in the compound, some wearing IR markers, others clearly unmarked civilians. The scenario was designed to test performance under stress after operational security had been compromised. Webb began engaging targets rapidly, his shots accurate, but without the careful consideration that the complex scenario required. His third shot hit an unmarked figure who immediately revealed himself to be a civilian role player. Team 4, you have engaged a hostage, came the angry transmission from headquarters. Mission failure. Withdraw immediately. The walk back to the staging area was conducted in complete silence. Webb's second mission failure in 12 hours had effectively ended his chances of graduating from the program, and his anger was palpable. Audrey felt a mixture of frustration and sympathy. Webb had the technical skills to be a competent sniper, but his inability to control his emotions under pressure created exactly the kind of problems that got people killed in real operations. Debrief was brutal and public. Colonel Hayes herself conducted the assessment, her expression grim as she reviewed the night's performance. Webb, you violated communication protocol, compromised operational security, and engaged a civilian target. In real counter-terrorism operations, those failures would result in hostage deaths and mission catastrophe. Webb's face was flushed with anger and embarrassment. Ma'am, the scenario was designed to be impossible. Too many variables, too much complexity for the time allowed. Asterisk, real terrorist situations are exactly that complex, Colonel Hayes replied coldly. If you can't handle complexity, you can't handle real-world sniper operations. The colonel turned to Audrey. Miller, your observation and analysis were excellent, but you failed to prevent your partner's critical errors. In team operations, both members are responsible for mission success. It was a fair criticism that stung more than Webb's outright failures. Audrey had seen the problems developing, but hadn't found an effective way to control Webb's impulsive behavior. However, Hayes continued, your judgment and tactical awareness were consistently superior. You identified civilians correctly and maintained operational security even after your position was compromised. As the candidates prepared to return to base camp, the elimination process continued. 3 more recruits were removed from the program based on their night exercise performance, bringing the class down to 13 candidates. Webb approached Audrey as they packed their gear, his usual arrogance replaced by something approaching desperation. I'm being recycled to the next class, he said quietly. They're giving me another chance, but I have to start over from the beginning. That's an opportunity, Audrey replied. Use it to work on judgment and patience. Easy for you to say. You're moving on to advanced training while I'm starting. Over with a bunch of new recruits. Webb's tone carried resentment, but also a grudging recognition that Audrey's approach had been consistently more successful than his own. The public failures had forced him to confront the reality that tactical aggression without judgment was a liability rather than an asset. Sarah Chun joined them as they prepared to board the transport vehicles. The night exercise was designed to break people, she said. Webb, you've got the shooting skills. Work on the thinking part, and you'll do fine in the next class. As the convoy rolled back toward Camp Henderson, Audrey reflected on the lessons learned during the Crucible exercise. The field training had revealed that technical shooting skills were only part of what made an effective sniper. Judgment, patience, and the ability to make complex decisions under extreme pressure were equally important. Her grandfather's rifle had performed flawlessly during both day and night exercises, but more importantly, her approach to precision and careful analysis had prevented multiple friendly fire incidents that could have been catastrophic in real operations. The advanced training phase would bring new challenges and higher stakes. Only 13 candidates remained from the original class of 24, and the elimination process would become even more ruthless as they approached graduation. But for the first time since arriving at Camp Henderson, Audrey felt truly confident in her abilities and her approach. The woman who'd been dismissed as too old, too slow, and too civilian had consistently outperformed Marines with more traditional backgrounds. Webb's failures had been instructive in their own way. They demonstrated that aggressive tactics without judgment could be more dangerous than careful hesitation. Real-world sniper operations required the wisdom to know when to shoot and when to wait, when to act decisively and when to gather more information. As the lights of Camp Henderson appeared through the darkness, Audrey knew that the hardest part of her journey was still ahead. Advanced training would test skills and judgment under conditions that closely replicated real combat operations. She also knew that she'd found her place in the program. The outsider had become an insider through performance rather than politics, and her unconventional background was proving to be a strength rather than a weakness. The real test would come when everything she'd learned was put to use in a situation where the stakes were real and the consequences of failure extended far beyond a training exercise grade. The advanced training facility at Camp Henderson was a world apart from the basic ranges where Audrey had first proven herself. Located in a restricted section of the base, it featured state-of-the-art equipment, classified scenarios, and instructors who'd operated in every major conflict zone of the past 2 decades. Chief Warrant, Officer Patricia Hawkins, was a legend. In special operations circles, a former Delta Force sniper with confirmed kills in Iraq, Afghanistan, and several classified operations that officially never happened. She stood before the 13 remaining candidates with the quiet confidence of someone who'd seen real combat and survived to teach others. Congratulations on making it this far, Hawkins began, her voice carrying authority that needed no amplification. You represent less than half of the original class, which means you've demonstrated basic competence under controlled conditions. Now we find out if you can perform when lives actually depend on your decisions. The advanced curriculum was designed around real-world scenarios drawn from recent military operations. Unlike the previous training phases that tested fundamental skills, this program would evaluate candidates' ability to operate independently in complex, rapidly changing situations where standard procedures might not apply. Your first assignment, Hawkins continued, is urban counter-sniper operations. You'll be working with FBI hostage rescue team protocols, which means some of you will be learning entirely new rules of engagement. Audrey felt a surge of confidence. Urban operations and federal law enforcement protocols were areas where her police background provided significant advantages over traditional military training. She'd attended FBI schools during her police career and understood the legal and tactical complexities of domestic operations. Sarah Chun leaned over during the briefing. Looks like your civilian experience might finally be an advantage instead of a liability. The training facility's urban complex was a marvel of military engineering, a mock city complete with apartment buildings, office complexes, and commercial districts. Role players populated the environment as innocent civilians, while hidden among them were targets representing various terrorist and criminal threats. Chun and Miller, Hawkins announced as she assigned training partners. You'll be working together for this phase. Your mission is to neutralize a sniper who's been taking shots at federal agents from somewhere in the downtown complex. The scenario was based on a real incident from Washington, D.C., where a lone gunman had terrorized the city for weeks, taking random shots at civilians and law enforcement from concealed positions throughout the metropolitan area. The FBI's hostage rescue team had ultimately located and eliminated the threat, but not before several agents had been wounded. Rules of engagement are federal law enforcement protocols, Hawkins explained. Positive identification required. Minimal collateral damage and preservation of evidence for prosecution. This isn't a combat zone. You're operating on American soil with American citizens present. The complexity of the scenario became apparent as Audrey and Sarah began their reconnaissance of the urban complex. Unlike military operations where enemies were clearly defined, this exercise required them to distinguish between innocent civilians and potential threats while operating under legal constraints that didn't exist in overseas combat. Contact front, Sarah whispered into her radio as they observed movement in a third-story window of an apartment building. Possible sniper position, approximately 300 yards northeast of our location. Audrey studied the building through her binoculars, noting details that Sarah's military training hadn't taught her to recognize. That's a photographer with a telephoto lens, she said quietly. Look at his body position and the way he's tracking movement. He's documenting the exercise, not participating in it. Sarah lowered her rifle, embarrassed by the near mistake. How did you know? Police work teaches you to observe before you act. Photographers move differently than snipers, and their equipment reflects differently in sunlight. The real challenge came 2 hours into the exercise when they identified what appeared to be a legitimate threat, a figure with a rifle positioned in a construction crane, overlooking the complex. The distance was approximately 600 yards, with wind conditions that would challenge even experienced shooters. I have eyes on a possible target, Audrey reported to headquarters. Adult male with rifle in elevated position, construction crane. Sector 7. Can you confirm hostile intent? Came the response from exercise controllers. Asterisk. This was where the scenario became genuinely difficult. The figure was clearly armed and in a position to threaten civilians, but federal rules of engagement required more than just the presence of a weapon to justify lethal force. He's tracking pedestrians through his scope, Sarah observed. That suggests targeting behavior. Audrey continued her observation, noting details that would be crucial in a real law enforcement situation. I need to see him actually threaten someone before I can engage. This isn't combat. We need probable cause. The wait was agonizing. Through their scopes, they watched the figure continue his surveillance of the crowds below. Then, suddenly he fired, a shot that struck a role player representing a federal agent conducting surveillance in the plaza. "Shots fired! Shots fired!" Audrey transmitted. "Federal agent down in the plaza. I have positive identification of the shooter. You are cleared to engage." Headquarters responded immediately. The shot required everything Audrey had learned during her weeks at Camp Henderson. 600 yards in crosswind conditions, with innocent civilians in the background and legal requirements for precision that left no margin for error. She controlled her breathing, calculated wind drift using techniques her grandfather had taught her decades earlier, and found her natural point of aim. The trigger broke cleanly, and through her scope, she watched the target fall backward off the crane platform onto the safety netting below. "Target down," Sarah confirmed through her spotting. Scope, clean hit, no collateral damage. The exercise debrief revealed the complexity of the scenario they'd just completed. Several other teams had either failed to identify the real threat or had engaged targets that turned out to be innocent civilians or law enforcement personnel in disguise. "Miller," Chief Hawkins said during the assessment, "your patience and observation skills prevented a friendly fire incident early in the exercise, and your shot was textbook perfect under federal row. Your police background clearly prepared you for domestic operations better than traditional military training." It was the first time since arriving at Camp Henderson that Audrey's civilian experience had been openly praised rather than criticized. The recognition felt even more meaningful coming from an instructor with Hawkins' combat credentials, but the advanced training wasn't finished testing the candidate's adaptability. The next scenario transported them to a mock embassy compound, where they would face international terrorism protocols, a completely different set of rules and procedures that would challenge everyone's ability to adapt quickly to changing operational requirements. "Tomorrow you'll be working with State Department security protocols," Hawkins announced. "Embassy protection involves multiple agencies, international law, and political considerations that can change everything you think you know about rules of engagement." That evening, as candidates studied their briefing materials for the embassy scenario, Audrey found herself in an unexpected position. Other candidates were approaching her for advice about federal law enforcement procedures, something that would have been unimaginable during the early weeks of training. "Miller," called David Thompson, one of the Marine infantry veterans who'd initially dismissed her civilian background. "Can you explain the difference between federal and military rules for evidence preservation after a shooting?" The conversation that followed revealed how much the dynamics had changed since the early days when she'd been mocked as an outsider who didn't belong. Her specialized knowledge was now being recognized as valuable rather than irrelevant. Sarah Chun joined the discussion as Audrey explained legal procedures that military personnel rarely encountered. "It's interesting how different mission requirements need different skills," Sarah observed. "Your police training is actually more relevant to some operations than traditional military experience." "Different tools for different jobs," Audrey replied. "The challenge is knowing which approach fits which situation." As the group dispersed to prepare for the next day's training, Audrey reflected on how far she'd come since arriving at Camp Henderson with her grandfather's rifle and a notebook full of wind calculations. The woman who'd been dismissed as too old, too slow, and too civilian was now being consulted by Marines with more traditional credentials, but she also knew that the hardest tests were still ahead. Embassy protection scenarios would introduce political complexities and international law considerations that could challenge even her expanded skill set. The margin for error in diplomatic security was virtually zero. Mistakes could trigger international incidents or compromise American foreign policy objectives. Her grandfather's rifle lay cleaned and ready for whatever challenges tomorrow would bring. But more importantly, Audrey had finally found her place in the program, not by conforming to military expectations, but by demonstrating that diverse backgrounds and experience could enhance rather than undermine operational effectiveness. The advanced training was proving that there wasn't just one way to be an effective sniper. Precision, judgment, and adaptability mattered more than conformity to traditional military culture. And in a world where threats came from many different sources requiring many different responses, the ability to think differently was becoming a crucial tactical advantage. The embassy scenario would test whether that philosophy could survive. The most complex and politically sensitive operations that American snipers might face in the modern world. The final week of sniper training arrived with an unexpected announcement that sent ripples of anxiety through the remaining 11 candidates. 3 more recruits had been eliminated during the embassy protection scenarios, unable to adapt to the complex political and legal requirements of diplomatic security operations. Your final exercise will be different from anything we've done before, Chief Warrant Officer Hawkins announced during the Monday morning briefing. Instead of scripted scenarios, you'll be participating in a joint training exercise with multiple federal agencies. Real agents, real equipment, real consequences for failure. The exercise, designated Operation Guardian Shield, was designed to test interagency cooperation during a simulated terrorist attack on a major American city. FBI, ATF, Secret Service, and local SWAT teams would all participate, with sniper candidates assigned to support various agencies based on their demonstrated skills and specializations. Miller, Hawkins said, consulting her assignment list, you'll be working with FBI Counterterrorism Division. Your assignment is overwatch protection for a federal judge who's been receiving credible death threats from a domestic terrorist group. Audrey felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. This was as close to real-world operations as training could get without actually deploying to active conflict zones. The federal judge scenario was based on actual cases where domestic terrorists had targeted federal officials, requiring the kind of precision and judgment that had become her specialty. The operation would take place in Atlanta, using real city infrastructure and involving genuine federal agents who didn't know which threats were real and which were part of the exercise. Only the command structure knew the full scope of the simulation, creating authentic stress and uncertainty for all participants. Special Agent Rebecca Santos of the FBI's Counterterrorism Division briefed Audrey on her specific assignment. Santos was a veteran agent with 15 years of experience protecting federal officials from domestic terrorism threats, and her no-nonsense demeanor made it clear that she expected professional competence regardless of Audrey's student status. Judge Harrison Williams has been receiving death threats for 6 months, Santos explained, showing Audrey surveillance photos and threat assessment documents. The threats reference his ruling in a federal case involving anti-government militia groups. Intelligence suggests a credible threat to his life during his scheduled appearance at the federal courthouse tomorrow. The complexity of the protection assignment became apparent as Santos outlined the security requirements. Judge Williams would be arriving at the courthouse via motorcade, conducting a 2-hour hearing on a high-profile terrorism case, and then departing for an undisclosed location. Each phase of the operation required different security considerations and potential threat vectors. Your position will be on the roof of the Marriott Hotel, approximately 400 yards from the courthouse entrance. Santos continued, you'll have overwatch responsibility for the arrival and departure zones, with secondary coverage of the building perimeter during the hearing. Audrey studied the tactical maps and aerial photographs, noting potential threat positions and escape routes that a hostile sniper might use. Her police experience with threat assessment and urban surveillance was directly applicable to this assignment, but the federal context added layers of complexity she'd never encountered. Agent Santos, Audrey asked, what's the threat profile? For potential shooters? Are we looking at trained military personnel or civilian amateurs? Intelligence suggests former military with combat experience and advanced marksmanship training. These aren't random criminals. They're organized, well-equipped, and highly motivated. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Real federal agents would be depending on her performance to protect a real federal judge from genuine threats that existed in the exercise scenario. Failure wouldn't just mean a poor grade. It could compromise actual security operations and put people at risk. That evening, Audrey conducted her reconnaissance of the operational area. Atlanta's federal courthouse district was a complex urban environment with multiple high-rise buildings, busy streets, and thousands of potential hiding places for hostile shooters. Her assigned position on the Marriott hotel roof provided excellent visibility but also exposed her to counter-surveillance from numerous locations. She spent hours studying sightlines, wind patterns, and potential threat positions, filling her notebook with the kind of detailed observations that had become her trademark. The morning would bring real-world pressure, unlike anything she'd experienced during training exercises. Sarah Chun, assigned to a different agency for the exercise, stopped by Audrey's hotel room that evening. "How are you feeling about tomorrow?" "Nervous," Audrey admitted. "This is what everything has been building toward. Real agents, real protection mission, real consequences." "You've got this," Sarah said firmly. "Your judgment and precision have been better than anyone else's throughout the program. Trust your training and your instincts." The operation began at 06:00 hours with Audrey taking her position on the Marriott roof as dawn broke over Atlanta. The city was already alive with morning traffic, creating a dynamic environment where threats could appear and disappear within seconds. "Guardian Overwatch, this is Guardian Base." Santos's voice crackled through Audrey's earpiece. "Judge's motorcade departing safe house in 15 minutes. Maintain overwatch of arrival zone." Through her scope, Audrey could see federal agents positioning themselves around the courthouse entrance. The FBI's counterterrorism division had deployed multiple teams, but her elevated position gave her the best overview of potential threat vectors from surrounding buildings. "Guardian Base, this is Guardian Overwatch," Audrey reported. "I have visual on the arrival zone. Multiple civilians present, no obvious threats detected." The motorcade arrived precisely on schedule, 3 black SUVs with federal markings and obvious security protocols. As Judge Williams emerged from the center vehicle, Audrey's scope swept the surrounding buildings, looking for any sign of hostile activity. That's when she saw it in a window of the office building across from the courthouse, approximately 600 yards from her position, a glint of reflected light that could only be a rifle scope. The angle and position were perfect for engaging the courthouse entrance, and the shooter's concealment was sophisticated enough to suggest professional training. "Guardian Base, possible threat contact," Audrey transmitted, her voice steady despite her racing pulse. "Office building, 6th floor, 3rd window from the east. I have what appears to be a rifle position with visual on the arrival zone. Guardian Overwatch, can you confirm hostile intent?" Santos responded immediately. Audrey studied the position through her scope, noting details that would be crucial for proper threat assessment. The figure was clearly armed with what appeared to be a high-powered rifle, positioned for optimal engagement of the courthouse entrance. But federal rules of engagement required more than just the presence of a weapon. "I can see a rifle and scope configuration consistent with sniper operations," Audrey reported. "Subject is tracking the judge's movement through his scope. That indicates targeting behavior. Guardian Overwatch, you are authorized to engage if the subject presents clear and immediate threat to protected person." Through her scope, Audrey watched as the figure in the office building adjusted his position and began acquiring what was clearly a shot at Judge Williams. The judge was still exposed in the courthouse entrance area, surrounded by agents. Vulnerable to precision fire from the elevated position, the hostile sniper's finger moved to his trigger. "Guardian Base, Subject is preparing to fire. I am engaging. The shot required everything Audrey had learned during her months at Camp Henderson and her years of police training. 600 yards in urban wind conditions with innocent civilians. In the background and legal requirements for precision that left no room for error, she controlled her breathing, calculated the wind drift using instincts developed through thousands of practice rounds, and found her natural point of aim. Her grandfather's rifle felt solid and familiar in her hands. As she made the final adjustments for the most important shot of her career, the trigger broke cleanly. Through her scope, she watched the hostile sniper jerk backward from his position as her bullet found its mark. The threat to Judge Williams had been eliminated with a single, precise shot that demonstrated everything the Marine Corps' sniper program was designed to teach. Guardian base, threat neutralized, Audrey reported, her voice calm despite the adrenaline. Coursing through her system. Target down, no collateral damage. Guardian overwatch, outstanding work. Judge is secure and moving to safe location. As the exercise concluded and the various agency teams began their debriefs, Audrey realized that she'd just completed the most challenging shot of her life under the most realistic conditions possible. The woman who'd been laughed out of basic training for being too slow and too careful had just proven that precision and judgment could save lives when it mattered most. But she also knew that this was just the beginning. Graduation from sniper school would mean assignment to real operations, where the stakes would be even higher and the consequences of failure would extend far beyond training exercises. Her grandfather's rifle had performed flawlessly, as it always had. But more importantly, Audrey had finally proven to herself that she belonged among the most elite marksmen in the military. The journey from outsider to expert was complete, but the real test of her skills was still ahead. 18 months. After graduation from Camp Henderson, Special Agent Audrey Miller found herself on a Seattle rooftop at 3:47 a.m., watching the federal building through her grandfather's rifle scope as the most dangerous domestic terrorism crisis in decades unfolded below. The call had come through FBI dispatch at 2:15 a.m. Armed group has seized the federal building. Approximately 37 hostages confirmed. Suspects claim to have explosives and are demanding the release of imprisoned militia leaders. The Cascadia Liberation Front had been on FBI watch lists for months, but intelligence had underestimated their operational capabilities. Led by former Army Ranger Derek Morrison and equipped with military-grade weapons, they'd executed a sophisticated takeover that had caught federal security completely off guard. "Miller, what's your assessment?" Special Agent Santos asked through the tactical radio. Santos had requested Audrey specifically for the FBI's counter-terrorism response team after their successful collaboration during the Atlanta protection mission. Through her scope, Audrey could see the building's lobby where hostages were being held under guard by armed terrorists. The sightlines were complex, with multiple levels and glass barriers that would complicate any rescue attempt. But her months of training in urban operations and hostage scenarios had prepared her for exactly this type of situation. "I count 5 armed subjects visible on the ground floor," Audrey reported. "Heavy weapons, body armor, and what appears to be professional tactical coordination. These aren't amateurs." The Seattle SWAT commander, Captain James Rodriguez, joined the tactical briefing. "Our negotiators have been trying to establish communication for over an hour. The subjects are demanding media coverage and the release of federal prisoners. They've threatened to start executing hostages if their demands aren't met by dawn." Dawn was less than 2 hours away. Audrey studied the building's architecture through her scope, noting details that would be crucial for any tactical intervention. The federal building's modern design created multiple sight lines, but also provided numerous positions where terrorists could establish crossfire zones that would devastate any rescue attempt. "Agent Miller," Captain Rodriguez said, Your reputation from the Atlanta operation has reached Seattle. We need your assessment of potential sniper solutions." It was the moment Audrey had been training for since her first day at Camp Henderson. Everything she'd learned about precision shooting, tactical patience, and complex decision-making under pressure would be tested in a situation where innocent lives hung in the balance. "The ground floor presents multiple challenges," Audrey began, her voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "Glass barriers will deflect standard ammunition, and the subjects are using hostages as human shields. Any shooting solution requires simultaneous engagement of multiple targets to prevent retaliation against civilians. How many shooters would you need?" Santos asked. Audrey continued her analysis, drawing on months of training in hostage rescue scenarios. "Minimum of 3 precision shooters with coordinated timing. But the real challenge isn't the shooting. It's identifying the moment when all subjects are positioned for simultaneous engagement without risk to hostages." The tactical team spent the next hour positioning additional sniper teams around the federal building. Each shooter was assigned specific targets, but the coordination required split-second timing that left no margin for error. At 5:23 a.m., the situation escalated dramatically. "All units, hostage executed," came the urgent transmission from surveillance. "Teams, subjects have killed 1 civilian and are threatening to kill 1 hostage every 15 minutes until their demands are met." The murder changed everything. Negotiation was no longer viable, and time was running out. The FBI's hostage rescue team began preparing for immediate tactical intervention, but the building's layout made traditional assault extremely dangerous. "Miller," Santos said over the radio, "we need options. The HRT can't breach without massive casualties." Through her scope, Audrey watched the terrorists reposition themselves after the execution. Their movements revealed something crucial, a pattern of coordination that suggested military training, but also created brief windows of vulnerability. "I have a possible solution," Audrey transmitted. "The subjects are rotating positions every 12 minutes for security sweeps. During the rotation, there's approximately a 45-second window where I can engage the primary threat without hostage casualties." Captain Rodriguez joined the conversation. "What kind of shot are we talking about?" Audrey calculated the distance and angles. 730 yards through glass, with wind conditions from the waterfront. The target will be partially concealed, moving, and surrounded by innocent civilians. The silence on the radio spoke volumes. It was an impossible shot under conditions that would challenge the most experienced snipers in the world. Miss, and the hostages would pay the price. Hit an innocent person, and the disaster would be multiplied. "Agent Miller," Santos said finally, "that's your call. You're the only shooter in position with the angle and skills for that engagement." At 5:41 a.m., Derek Morrison appeared in Audrey's scope. The terrorist leader was conducting his security sweep, moving through the lobby with the confident stride of someone who believed his position was impregnable. He was carrying an assault rifle and had positioned himself near a group of hostages who would be vulnerable if the shot failed. Audrey controlled her breathing, feeling the familiar calm that had carried her through months of training and real-world operations. Her grandfather's rifle was steady in her hands, the scope clear and properly zeroed. All the calculations, all the practice, all the criticism and doubt had led to this moment. The wind gauge showed crosswind conditions from the northwest. The glass would deflect her bullet slightly, requiring compensation she'd practiced but never executed under these conditions. The target was moving slowly but predictably, following a pattern she'd observed during 3 previous security sweeps. "Taking the shot," Audrey whispered into her radio. Time seemed to slow as she found her natural point of aim. Morrison was 70% exposed, his center mass visible through the building's glass wall. The hostages were positioned to his left, far enough away to be safe if the shot was precise, but close enough to be endangered. If it went wide, Audrey squeezed the trigger with the same steady pressure her grandfather had taught her decades earlier. Bullet traveled 730 yards in 1.2 seconds, passing through the building's outer glass and striking Derek Morrison center mass. The terrorist leader dropped immediately, his weapon clattering across the lobby floor as the remaining subjects reacted with shock and confusion. "Target down," Audrey reported, already acquiring her next target through the scope. The death of their leader created exactly the chaos the HRT needed. Flashbang grenades exploded through the building's windows as federal agents poured through. Multiple entry points. The remaining terrorists, caught off guard by the sudden loss of their commander, were overwhelmed before they could harm additional hostages. "All subjects down," came the transmission from the HRT commander. "Building secure, hostages safe." 36 innocent lives had been saved by a single shot from a rifle that everyone had once dismissed as too old and inadequate for modern operations. As dawn broke over Seattle, Audrey disassembled her grandfather's rifle with the same careful attention she'd shown since her first day at Camp Henderson. The weapon that had carried 3 generations of her family through life and death. Situations had performed flawlessly when it mattered most. Special Agent Santos climbed to the rooftop as the crisis concluded. "Outstanding work, Miller. That shot saved dozens of lives." "Just doing my job," Audrey replied. But she felt the deep satisfaction that came from knowing all her training had been validated in the most important way possible. "There's going to be significant media attention from this operation," Santos continued. "The shot you made will be studied in law enforcement academies for years." As Audrey packed her equipment, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The woman who'd been laughed out of sniper school for being too slow, too old, and too different had just completed one of the most challenging precision shots in law enforcement history. Her grandfather's rifle was heading home to Phoenix, where it would be cleaned and maintained for whatever challenges the future might bring. But more importantly, Audrey Miller had proven that sometimes the most unlikely heroes are exactly what the world needs. The outsider had become the expert, not by conforming to others' expectations, but by staying true to the principles of precision, patience, and careful judgment that had guided her from the beginning. In a world that often valued speed over accuracy and aggression over wisdom, she'd shown that the old ways could still save the day when everything was on the line. The shot heard around the law enforcement community would be remembered not just for its technical difficulty, but for the reminder that sometimes being different isn't a weakness. It's exactly the strength that makes all the difference. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.